Hey, welcome back. I'm Ibnul J. Farabi, and this is Flashpoints, the wars that shaped us. You know, I was thinking the other day, as I was walking through the grid of Manhattan streets, about how we draw lines. Not just on maps, but between people, us and them, ally and enemy. It's a habit that gives the chaos of history a comforting, simple shape. But history has a way of blurring those lines in the most extraordinary ways. And perhaps no story blurs them more completely than the one that unfolded over a few desperate hours in the Austrian Alps in May of 1945. This is the story of the battle for Castle Itter, the day American soldiers and German Wehrmacht troops fought side by side. To set the scene, it's May 4th, 1945. Adolf Hitler is dead, Berlin is falling. The war in Europe is, for all intents and purposes, over. But in the Tyrolean Alps, near the small Austrian town of Itter, the war isn't quite finished. Perched on a hilltop is a beautiful, but grim, 19th century castle. It had been used by the SS as a VIP prison, a Sonderlager, and its inmates were some of the most valuable political prisoners left in the Reich. The former French Prime Ministers Édouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, the legendary French commander General Maurice Gamelin, even the tennis star Jean Barotra, a former Wimbledon champion. These people were bargaining chips, and as the Nazi regime crumbled, their guards fled, leaving them in a precarious limbo. They were free, but not safe. Because while the regular German army was surrendering in droves, fanatical SS units were still roaming the countryside, hunting down deserters and anyone they deemed traitors, including these high-profile prisoners. The prisoners knew a rogue SS battalion was coming to recapture the castle, or worse. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, elements of the American 12th Armored Division were advancing. A reconnaissance team, led by a brilliant and resourceful officer, Captain John C. Jack Lee Jr., got word of the prisoners' plight from a local resistance fighter and a daring Austrian major of the Wehrmacht named Joseph Sepp Gangl. Now, Gangl is a crucial figure here. He was a decorated German officer who had seen enough of the war and the SS brutality. He had already been secretly working with the Austrian resistance. To him, those prisoners weren't enemies. They were human beings in dire need of protection from the true fanatics of his own collapsing nation. So he made a choice. He defied his crumbling chain of command, gathered about a dozen of his own men who were willing to follow him, and linked up with the Americans. Think about that moment. A Wehrmacht major, in full uniform, approaching an American tank column not to surrender, but to ask for their help. Captain Lee didn't hesitate. He took a small force, just 14 men and a single Sherman tank, and, with Gangl and his Germans, raced to Castle Itter to set up a defense. So you have this tiny, almost absurdly outnumbered force digging in around the castle courtyard. Inside, two former French prime ministers. Outside, a handful of American GIs, a handful of German Wehrmacht soldiers, and a few armed French prisoners themselves, including the tennis star Barotra, who was apparently itching for a fight. And bearing down on them were between 100 and 200 veteran Waffen-SS troops, heavily armed, with nothing left to lose. The lines had not just blurred, they had been completely redrawn. In that courtyard, the alliance wasn't defined by nationality, but by a simple, last-minute principle: the defense of the innocent against fanaticism. The attack came at dawn on May 5th. The SS stormed the castle gates with machine guns and Panzerfausts. The fighting was fierce in close quarters. Captain Lee's single Sherman tank, nicknamed Besotten Jenny, fired point-blank at the main gate until it was destroyed by a Panzerfaust. The defenders were pushed back into the castle itself, room by room, fighting from the windows. Ammunition was running critically low. Major Gangl, fighting alongside the Americans, was killed by a sniper's bullet while trying to move the former French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud to safety. He became, in that moment, the last Austrian soldier to die in the war in Europe, and he died under the American flag, defending a French statesman. It's a detail that still gives me chills. By mid-morning, the situation was desperate. They were almost out of time. And this is where the story takes another almost cinematic turn. Jean Barotra, the tennis champion, volunteered for a suicide mission. He said he was used to sprinting. He would vault the castle wall, dash through the SS lines, and run to the nearest American position to get help. And he did it. In an incredible feat of athleticism and courage, He dodged through the woods and found an American relief force that had been stalled, unsure of where the castle was or if the prisoners were even still alive. Barotra guided them back. In the early afternoon, with the defenders down to their last few rounds, the American relief column arrived with tanks and infantry. The SS, caught between the castle and the new force, broke and fled into the woods. The battle was over. The prisoners were saved. Now, I'm an engineer by training, here in New York. I look for systems, for logic. And the logic of World War II was a brutal, binary one. Allied versus Axis. Good versus evil. And in the broadest sense, that binary holds true. But what Castle Itter shows us is that within those colossal, crushing systems, there is always room for individual human choice. Major Gangle chose conscience over blind loyalty. Captain Lee chose a risky humanitarian mission over simple, safe advancement. These men, on the very last day of the war, chose to define their duty not to a flag, but to other people. They created a tiny, temporary pocket of sanity in the insanity. We tell stories about war to understand sacrifice, strategy, and the cost of ideology. But we also tell them to find these flashes of unexpected humanity. They remind us that the categories we live by are often too small for the complexities of real life. In a world that constantly asks us to pick a side, to harden our hearts against a designated them, the story of Castle Itter whispers a powerful counter-narrative. It says that sometimes, the most heroic side to pick is the one that protects the vulnerable, regardless of what uniform they, or you, used to wear. That's it for this episode of Flashpoints. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the lines we draw in our own lives, I'd be so grateful if you'd share it with someone. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. This show is produced by Light Knot Studios. You can find more of our narrative documentaries and support our work by visiting lightknotstudios.com. Thanks for listening. I'm Ibnul J. Farabi. Until next time, take care.